If you were looking down at Earth from the International Space Station, one of the most visible features would be the Himalayan mountains. This range is more than just striking. It covers one of the most contested borders that's rarely talked about in the West. That of India and China. As it turns out, there has been a war here, and with renewed tensions and skirmishes in the region, how likely is a full-scale war today, and what are the outcomes of fighting in freezing cold temperatures 7,000 meters above the rest of the world? To understand the current conflict between China and India up here in the Himalayas, and to determine if a full-scale war could feasibly happen between these two superpowers, we're going to break this video into 3 chapters: the border history, the region's geography, and how tensions have risen in the past 2 decades. Long before any conflict between these two nations arose, people have inhabited the region surrounding the Himalayas for over 12,000 years. This is the Indian Himalayan region, from the south in the Shavlik foothills, and it extends all the way north to the Tibetan plateau. Look at any map in the region and the range is an easily visible feature. But if we zoom in, things get more complicated. Where do you draw the borderline? And as it turns out, not even China and India can agree on this. With both countries being nuclear capable, this has led to a host of problems that many outside of the region have worried could blow up quickly. Now, China is not the only country India has mountainous border disputes with. Famously, disputes in the region of Kashmir have flared at times with Pakistan, leading to an uneasy peace, and much like with China, it's been due to difficulties agreeing on an established borderline. But back to China, India has had 2 major areas at the forefront of its dispute over the past century. The first of these is Aksai Chin in the north, a region India claims as part of the state of Ladakh, and that China claims as part of the Xinjiang province. The history of the dispute is long, but I'm going to give you the shorter version so you understand where they're at today and what a likely outcome of a full-scale war could be. The first instance of border dispute in Aksai Chin stretches back to the conquest by the Sikh Empire in the 1830s. This was followed by a bloody frontier raising by British troops in the 1840s. In a rare act of peacefulness, the British invited representatives from the Qing dynasty to negotiate a formal border, though the Chinese representatives had no interest in a formal meeting for what they considered a sparsely populated, faraway province. In 1862, the Chinese government was expelled from the region directly north of Aksai Chin in the Dungang Revolt. This led to what many native Uyghurs believed would be a long-lasting independent East Turkestan. Spoilers here, it didn't. In 1864, British surveyor W.H. Johnson was commissioned from a government in British India to survey the Aksai Chin region, in hopes of finally establishing a formal border. In short, this led to a line called the Johnson Line. It ended up being used by the British, Chinese, and even the government of Tibet, and this line has been the source of many conflicts since. In 1954, India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, not only firmly declared the Johnson Line the border with China, but stated that the region had been part of India for centuries, and that its inclusion was non-negotiable. This was despite widespread uncertainty on both sides still about where the exact border was. In the mid-50s, the Chinese government under Chairman Mao constructed a road through Aksai Chin from Xinjiang to Tibet, and infuriating to India, was easily accessible from China, but not from India. There, the lands of Xinjiang, also known as East Turkestan, were under the control of China. The people of Tibet, under the rule of the Dalai Lama, had sought full-on independence at many points throughout history, in particular after World War II. Fun fact, China has continuously refused to give it to them. The Dalai Lama has been a ruler in exile since the 50s, and the Chinese government has increased their rule over the decades.
There's nothing fun about those facts at all.
Yeah, okay, true. But there was a border between Tibet and India for a time. It was established along the McMahon Line, conducted between representatives of China, Tibet, and British India. This was known as the Simla Accord. This set the border more or less along the mountains, literally with it being interpreted to set the border post by the highest point in the range. But over time, China began moving the border posts gradually further south, as in they were physically going up there and moving literal posts. The government of China would later walk back on the agreement, rejecting Tibet's independence and saying that they had no right to have representatives at the meeting. After peace talks fell through on the 20th of October 1962, China launched invasions into India in both Aksai Chin and through Chinese-occupied Tibet to secure borders they thought had been rightfully established. Though the war only lasted just over a month, it ended with China having attended its desired border lines, bolstered by a refusal to march any further into India after these borders were secured. This war perhaps could be called the highest war in history, due to being fought along the high mountain ranges. Like in battles of centuries past, this war was fought mostly on foot, even if it resulted in an embarrassing Indian defeat. The Sino-Indian War, as it became known, showed geopolitics at their absolute messiest. In terms of this small war, even though Chinese troops outnumbered Indian troops 3-1, Indian troops were backed by the power of the Soviet Union. But despite the Indian Army's superior weapons, China's manpower advantage meant Xinjiang and Tibet still remained firmly under Chinese control. A more formalized border was declared between China and India in Aksai Chin afterwards, formally named the Line of Actual Control. However, though it was a win for China, it was one that was physically uncomfortable to gain and politically uncomfortable to maintain. Establishing a line and reaffirming its existence, as was done between the two nations in the 90s, does not necessarily mean a lasting peace. Over the past decades, tensions have once again flared, first with the Doklam standoff in 2017, where the Chinese and Indian troops stood each other down along the world's highest border, after China attempted to construct a road into Bhutan's Doklam Plateau. Thankfully, the Doklam standoff was settled diplomatically, but still marked a surge in border tension to the most hostile point in nearly 50 years. Then, on the 15th of June 2020, tensions fully came to a head in the Ladakh confrontation. No shots were fired, though troops from both sides engaged in hand-to-hand combat that left 20 dead and nearly 80 injured. China is a very different country than it was 50 years ago, as is India. China now commands one of the world's most powerful militaries, and has used its power to exert increasing influence over regions such as the South China Sea, which we touched on our recent videos in Australia. In 2022, China and India are also respectively two of the world's most populous countries, numbering around 1.4 billion people each, but despite the buildup of power and influence, particularly from China, and the re-emergence of skirmishes along the border, it is unlikely that a full-on war will emerge over the border disputes. Both countries want land that they feel is rightfully theirs, and yet it seems for now the best that they can hope for is an uneasy peace. A big part of this, of course, obviously seeing what this channel is about, is geography. The mountains are hostile and sparsely populated. Whilst there are scattered bases from each country around the border region, there are no truly major settlements right along the border itself. Looking at China specifically, that's not to say that there aren't major cities within Tibet and Xinjiang. There are, but to say that any settlements within either of these two semi-autonomous regions is near the border would be completely false. And though China is more heavily armed than India, if a traditional march is what it takes to breach the Himalayas, then the Chinese are at further disadvantage thanks to geography. The Indian side of the mountains often give way to fertile farmlands. The Chinese side, however, is in the rain shadow, and with the rain shadow comes deserts. The conflict between the two along this border would be a logistical nightmare. Worst case scenario, any further war would develop into scattered fights in the mountains that lasted for years, if not decades, with no real space available for large-scale fights. Besides, Xinjiang and Tibet are large provinces. They are provinces that China has had trouble enough trying to keep as part of the country. It could be argued that China is much more willing to try to keep border tensions with India low, while their plans to further bring these two regions under control are underway. They want to avoid war, yet make sure the Himalayan buffer remains. It's like a catch-22. Yet both Xinjiang and Tibet have large independence movements. Tibet itself is represented by a government in exile, and who, as of 2011, officially believes that Tibetan people deserve not only independence, but a democratically elected government, something that the authoritarian China especially does not want. Though the historical inhabitants of Xinjiang do not have representatives to speak for them globally as the Tibetans do with the Dalai Lama, there has been a push for an independent East Turkestan for well over a century now. However, attempts to protest and rise up by the native Uyghur Muslim people have been met harshly by the government in Beijing, with many of them forced into concentration camps. And that's not to mention the softer means the Chinese government is using to rein in Tibet and Xinjiang. The government has heavily invested in factories, cities, and infrastructure development in these western provinces. And with that growth has come a huge influx of Han Chinese workers. Official Chinese government sources from 2021 show an even number of Han and Uyghur people in Xinjiang, though other reports state that Uyghurs have been forced to become minorities in their own homeland. With less native ethnic presence comes less room for government dissent, and less local opposition to the growing factories that produce cheap goods that are exported globally. Hey, I'm switching things up just for 1 second. I want to acknowledge some of the wording that was just used. Please don't take any of what was just said to condemn immigration in places like the US, Canada, Europe, or the UK. This isn't a critique on that. Rather, this is an acknowledgement of the fact that though Tibet and Xinjiang on paper are autonomous regions within China, in reality, they're anything but. China has only gotten tougher on these regions with time. In the context of this video, it's especially worth mentioning why this is being done, and it's not purely for show of power. China is preventing two potential Indian allied nations from forming by retaining these regions. They are forcing the border to stay in the Himalayan region because that's just smart strategy. It's a buffer between them and another growing power. To the north, China is bordered by friendly Russia and non-threatening Mongolia. Besides India, all the other nations they border are seen as small non-threats. And if these buffer provinces are retained, even if it comes at the destruction of the people who have lived there for a millennia, then their border with India is forced to hold, along with an effective no man's land. Because realistically, who wants to fight a war on foot at 7,000 meters high in the mountains?